I made a little swatch using 4 different applique methods, and as usual, I'm glad I did it because I learned a lot. As a viewer suggested, I went ahead and used contrasting thread so you can see it better on camera. For these first 2 swatches, I used the iron-on adhesive, and I used a straight stitch for this one and a zigzag stitch for this one. A very narrow zigzag stitch. And while this looks a little messy with the contrasting thread, I think with a little practice and with a more easily or a better coordinating thread, you won't even be able to notice it on the quilt. So that's a plus. The minus is that I'm worried about how the edges will wear, because I've been to quilt shows before that had iron-on, and there were like all sorts of threads hanging off, and like some of them really long. So while this would be the absolute fastest method, I'm a little worried about wear. That being said, I don't know how often I will wash the quilt, and maybe I just make it like a dry clean only quilt. Now the zigzag adds a little extra texture, which I don't hate. I thought I would hate it, but I don't hate it. It was pretty easy to stay on the line and keep everything lined up. The problem was the points. I had no idea how to finish those points or how to turn the points, so they're a little messy. I don't know if I would want to do it on the whole quilt though. So those are the 2 iron-ons, and then if I slide this way, these 2 leaves were done using a turned edge applique in 2 different methods, and then this one was sewn down with a straight stitch and this one was sewn with an invisible stitch. And for the record, this is my all-time favorite way to do applique. It's just also the absolute longest way to do it, and so that's very frustrating. I would love to finish my quilt in this applique method, but I just don't have it in me to do a whole quilt using this method. I usually do like little pieces here and there, but a whole quilt is like completely out of the question, unfortunately. Now this one, I have found that the bulk in the points here was enough to push the or to pull the fabric down into my machine and make a mess. I made a big mess on this side, a little bit of a mess over here. I think this is probably my second favorite method compared to the needle turn applique, but because of the points on the leaves, I'm not sure if it's a very good fit for the quilt. So next step, I'm going to finish the edges and do a little tiny bit of quilting, and then I'm going to throw it in the wash to see how it washes and dries, and to see just how much this and maybe this one frays. So I'll be back in just a little bit after this swatch has been put through the ringer, so to speak. And through the magic of editing, here it is. My sample is all washed and dried, and it's got that lovely sort of crinkly squishiness to it. But I have finally come to a decision on how I'm going to handle the applique for the quilt. First of all, I want to say the needle turn is just so dreamy. It is absolutely my favorite method. It sort of sinks into the background. It sort of melds with the into the quilt, I think, whereas these other 3 methods they feel like they're sitting on top of the quilt, if that makes sense. But unfortunately, I just don't have the time to do this one. So that one is marked off of my list. Over here is the raw edge applique, and you can see even after just one wash, it already has that sort of fray, although it isn't as bad as I had expected. It wasn't all stringy, but it does make me wonder about the longevity of this finish, and so I'm going to take that one off my list as well. That brings us down to these 2. So my main gripes with this one is I don't know how to handle the corners very well, and the main gripe with this one is that my machine doesn't know how to handle the corners very well. I like that this one has the same sort of softness as the needle turn because there's no fusible behind it, but I like how quickly I can cut these out. So I'm actually going to do a combination of the 2. I'm going to do a zigzag and a coordinating thread for all of my stems, and then I'm going to do this turned edge method for my leaves. And when I get to the corners, I think I'm just going to I'm just going to advance the needle by hand so that I can hopefully avoid these getting sucked into the machine. So that is my plan at the moment. I think this iron-on method is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to demo that one, but I will go ahead and demo this one because it's a little different than what you might have seen before. I use a double layer of freezer paper and some spray starch, and it's just a little bit different. So I'll show you how I do that one. Before I move on, I want to show you how I'm auditioning this fabric, because while I think stripes would be neat on the leaves, I also think that it might be overpowering. So I cut out one leaf and I turned the edges and everything, and I pinned it up onto my quilt on the design wall. And you can see it is interesting. It's an interesting detail, but I think it is too much in this case, especially because of this fabric here. I think it's a little bit busy, it pulls the eye too much, and it sort of fights with this print. So I'm going to use this piece as a demo piece, but I'm not going to actually use it on my quilt. So here I have a double layer of freezer paper. Basically, I just ironed on a piece of freezer paper onto the back of another piece of freezer paper. And the reason I did that is because this method is good with just a little bit extra bulk, a little more sturdy of a piece. So I just laid it on top of my shape printout and I just traced it. If you don't want to do that, maybe it's too stressful on your eyes or your light source isn't bright enough, you can use a light board or you can just hold it up to a window. I would actually recommend taping this onto the window so it doesn't move, and then maneuvering this around as needed to trace that shape. And definitely don't worry about being perfect, because leaves are not perfect and they're not all the same, so it's okay if you get a little bit of variation. Don't be too hard on yourself. Then I'm just going to get my paper scissors and cut those out. And if you have a wobbly line, this is the perfect time to smooth that out with your scissors. And the good thing about this is that they are reusable, so you only have to do these a few times. You don't have to make like 72 for the whole quilt. You can just make a few and then reuse them over and over again. So first things first, I'm going to iron these down on the wrong side of my fabric. Quick as that. Then I'm going to take my good fabric scissors and cut at least half or at least a quarter of an inch around the edge. And it's really better to have a little bit extra fabric than to have a little too scant of fabric. You can be pretty rough with this because it's not going to show. I believe this method was developed by Jill Finley, but don't quote me on that. She's the one that I saw demonstrate it, I don't know, a couple years ago maybe just last year. And she made it look so simple. I'm going to link that video in the description of this video because she goes into depth on how to do it, and it's wonderful. So if I miss anything here or something doesn't make sense here, definitely go check out that video and that'll help a lot. So for this method, I am actually doing sort of a knockoff method. She has tools specifically for it, sold all in a set, but I don't have that. And instead, I'm just using a seam ripper, a makeup brush, and spray starch. I'm going to link to this too in my description, but I think you can find it really cheap at Walmart. So if you can't find it at Walmart, then check out, I think, Amazon. And what you do is you just take this is the cap for the spray starch, and you spray right in there. And then it turns sort of foamy and bubbly, but as that dissipates, it just becomes a clear liquid. Normally with curved applique, you cut notches into the side, but it's not necessary here. So you get your brush wet, and then you wet the seam allowance like so. And then you use your seam ripper, or there's that tool you can get, it's sort of a stiletto, to hold the fabric in place, and then you use the lip of your iron to lift the fabric and push it over. And you can use your stiletto or seam ripper to pull that edge tight to the template. And so basically you're using your iron and the starch to press in that strong, flat curve for your applique. After that's dry, I'm just going to flip it and do it again for the other edge. So starch. I probably use too much, but there you go. And then I'm just going to do it all over again for that side. Lift it with your iron. And this can feel pretty awkward since you're using your left hand to pull the fabric. But Jill gives a good reason for that in her video, if you want to check that out. And I'm doing this specifically on my ironing board and not my felt pressing mat because I think it gets a little messy and there gets to be a little bit of buildup. And after I'm done with this, I can take my ironing board cover off and wash it and get it all clean. So here you're going to notice that there are these pieces here sticking out. And I'm not going to cut those off because if you do, you'll get fraying on the edges or on the points. So instead, I'm going to sew along this side, and then when I turn it at my sewing machine, I'm going to tuck these under and then tuck it under. I'm going to set this leaf aside to actually use on my quilt, and I'll bring in my scraps here. So this is that striped leaf that is just too busy for my quilt. So before I stick this down to my background fabric, I'm going to peel these back gingerly, and then I can remove the freezer paper. And you can see the starch holds that crisp line pretty well. So I'm going to bring in my handy dandy Elmer's glue with my precision point, and I'm going to put just a tiny bit of glue in the seam allowance. Just dot it in like this. And I'm not going to put it on the points because I want to have some extra room under there to tuck that fabric at the end. So just in the seam allowance and not on the points. And then I flip it over and press it down and making sure that all of that fabric is tucked under. Oh, and you might have noticed I cut notches into this one in the excess just to see what would happen. And you can see that, oh, maybe you can't see on camera. It makes just a little bit less smooth of a turn if you cut the notches in. So for time's sake, I'm going to heat set this, but normally I might just let that dry naturally. I'm going to move my needle all the way over to the right, and then I'll put this right under here. And so remember, for this, I'm going to sew this side first. So the excess fabric is over there. I'm going to sew this side first, and because my machine is weird, I'm going to be hand advancing the wheel, this one right here, in the hopes of not getting that fabric sucked under into my machine. And please be patient with me because I'm doing this with the camera right directly in front of my face, so I can barely see what I'm doing. Okay, I'm gonna advance it, backstitch. Oh, and I'm gonna make sure my needle position is down. Okay, now I'm gonna advance and advance. I think that's close to the point. Oh wait, I think I can do another one. and now I'm going to turn it. And at this point, I'm going to use something sharp to push that extra fabric under. And I can't tell if I'm doing this accurately because I can't see it. But the goal is to get that under without any threads showing through. I'm going to put the camera aside for a second to see if I'm getting this under. Okay, so I got that tucked under, and I'm going to continue top stitching that down. When I get down here, I'm going to make sure that my threads are tucked away, whoops, to the side so they don't get tangled. And I'll keep going. Before I get to the end, I'm going to tuck in this side. And again, I'm going to struggle with the camera. Okay, I'm going to put the camera aside again, and I'll show you the finished result. So here's the finished result. I promise it isn't as hard as I made it look because you won't be doing it with a camera in front of your face. But I think that's pretty neat. I managed to not get the points sucked under into the machine. I did sew off the side here because I couldn't see what I was doing, but not bad altogether. Then this is what the back will look like, and it doesn't have that stiff, gluey feel to it. So now I just have to cut out and press all my leaves and my stems. I'm not going to actually do the circles because I'm not really feeling the circles. I think I'm going to add some custom applique. I just haven't decided what I'm going to add yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and prep those shapes, and then I'll show you how I'm going to do the layout. Okay, real quick, I'm going to end this video sort of abruptly because I just got a severe weather warning, and I don't want to get interrupted by sirens or anything. So I'm going to try to quickly wrap this up. I have some of my pieces in place, and this is sort of like a rough draft. I've just pinned them on. And I was testing out this light purple for the stem, and I've decided it's just not pulling its weight here. So I'm going to test other fabrics. So far, this one seems to be the one I'm liking. The only other place I've used this fabric is right here in these tulip blocks. So I think the darker color will help sort of ground it and give it more weight instead of this light lavender gray, hopefully, because I don't have a lot of choices at this point. As far as layout goes, I did put together the big layout guide thing, but it's turning out to be like way more unwieldy than I want. So I'm just going to eyeball it mostly. Definitely eyeball it with the leaves, and I'm going to try to be more accurate with the stems because I think the stems are what give the block structure. So mostly I'm referencing this photo here, and I'm trying to pay attention when it comes to the leaves. I'm trying to pay attention to the angle and also which part of the seam it's covering. So I want to cover that seam there, and about 1/3 here, and so on. So I'm just going to eyeball that. As far as this upper corner goes, the photo shows that's where you're putting a bunch of circles. I'm going to do some kind of custom applique there, I think. And I have a couple ideas, but I haven't settled on anything yet, so I'll show you that in my next video. So sorry for the abrupt ending here. If I've left anything out, or if there's anything that's sort of unclear about this process, will you leave a comment in my comment section down below so I can know what I missed, and then in the next video I can sort of clear it up and refocus and help you guys out if you need it. Anyway, if you enjoyed this scattered, crazy video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you again next week.